What, Moses?
We are lost.
Changed my life. All of the Israelites complained against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. Why? Because they were lost. They were lost in food, and water along the way was sparse. And at this point, they might have been, 35 days into the journey, which is 35 days down, 39 years, 11 months to go, with Moses and Aaron out in front and thousands of people behind them imploring, "Are we there yet? Are we there yet? Are we there yet? Are we there yet?" They're heading out onto the Sinai Peninsula, then moving south to the Promised Land, which is northeast. And if you've ever traveled with a driver who does not know the way but refuses to acknowledge it, you know how testy things can become. You can picture a Moses who raises up his staff towards the rising sun and announces, "Come, we shall travel west." And behind him is the sound of 600,000 hands smacking their foreheads. For 40 years they drift in this desert. Moses will not make it, but Aaron will take the lead and get them to their destination. And at this point, Moses' people are hungry and they are lost. It's said that when the people of Israel first grumbled and complained against God and against Moses, accusing them of leading them from slavery in Egypt only so that he could kill them in the wilderness, that God responded to their kvetching by promising to provide them with quail in the evening and bread of heaven in the morning. And on the first morning, they were to collect this bread of heaven formed by the dew of night, collecting around a substance that grew in the trees overhead until it became so heavy that it would just drop to the ground. They did not know what it was, and they asked each other what it might be. And this bread of heaven that appeared to have fallen, at least from heaven, though it really formed in trees and came together on the desert floor each morning at dawn. This daily provision became known as manna. We've heard of manna in the wilderness. When we hear about manna, we wonder, what is it? Clearly, they wondered the same thing, because back then the word manna literally means, what is it? And so they picked up this, what is it, every morning. And even though the people of Israel were liberated from their bondage in Egypt among the plagues of the frogs, the locusts, there was the parting of the Red Sea. In fact, every miracle would indicate that they had found favor with God. They failed to place their trust in any hope that if they just persevered, instead of bitterly complaining, they would be led in the right direction. Perhaps it's always that way. Wilderness. Who's been in the wilderness? Many of the Israelites were taking on a backward look to Egypt. Yes, they were in bondage. That was pretty bad, but at least there was steady, if meager, rations. And yeah, where they were staying wasn't so nice, but it was the same place they could rest at night. And so with fear comes the temptation to make the past look better than it was. Have we heard any of that? These are wilderness times today, and although we don't know how long we'll remain lost, here's a snapshot of what we're in the middle of. The earthquakes in Mexico. And so today we pray for the people of Mexico after still another earthquake, and hope that their efforts and the presence of our own relief efforts and relief efforts of people all around the world will be there to help find still more life in ruins while staying on to help comfort and to clear. This coming up is a Flat Earth Society card. We acknowledge that, do you know what the Flat Earth Society is, by the way? There actually is a Flat Earth Society, folks who believe firmly that the Earth is flat. And there's a society, and here's someone here. He's a paid-up member to 1977. I found associate memberships 1990-something. I think it's still around. You Google them, and you'll find some interesting shots of how they prove this. But we acknowledge that some of what is happening right now is through climate change. And I would posit at this point that anyone who is still now a climate change denier could apply for a card similar to this as a Flat Earth Society. We acknowledge that some of what's happening is through climate change, and we've witnessed it now in the terrible damage in Florida and Texas and Puerto Rico and the islands off the coast. First, of course, the response of relief and resources to help get people building and rebuilding and back in their homes if feasible. And next, a renewed effort to make the connection between what we are doing to our planet and how it will continue to manifest itself in more and more severe weather systems until we turn people's hearts and minds to the seriousness of our situation. And this morning, I'm so grateful that we have officially become a Creation Justice Church. Thank you for the efforts of the Green Faith Committee. Wilderness. Young boys, young girls, men and women, and I was corrected by Dave Smith gently. These are folks who were brought here as infants and as young children, living with dreams for their future, college, law school, a new business, the willingness to risk something big for something good, some 800,000 of them who grew up here, though born elsewhere, now find themselves in limbo with the prospect of being deported to what is to them a foreign land where their parents were born. We're talking about DACA now. What a loss, and what a loss to our country too, that an educated workforce, possibly made to bring their gifts and talents elsewhere. And thanks also to Dave Smith, if you saw his letter that was published last week, drawing our attention to these young people on behalf of the Advocates for Peace and Justice. Wilderness. Wilderness is happening all around us. Hate groups. There's a rise in hate groups now in our country. There are no pretty good folks in these groups. These are people who fear their unearned privilege is under attack. They are constantly comparing the past with the present and doubting what the future will bring. They are constantly evaluating what it is they think they should have against what they do have. In part, that is the message of a parable of the workers in the vineyard in the gospel reading that complements the reading from Exodus. Don read that to you this morning, and I thought I'd just bring in this gospel reading, this parable myself today. You may remember this story because, in a way, it just seems so unfair. It's a story about something that just feels unfair. Jesus told a story about this landowner who, needing workers to bring in the harvest, goes to the local marketplace in the morning and he hires workers and he agrees to give them a denarius, which is a coin that was equal to 1 day's pay for a laborer for 1 day's work. And several times during the day, the landowner returns to the marketplace and he finds people standing in the unemployment line, people who have no work or income, and he hires them. He brings them back, saying to them that he will give them what is right. Even at the 11th hour, near the end of the day, the landowner goes to the marketplace and he finds others standing around, people who no one has hired, and he takes them on. And at the end of the day, the work day is over. The landowner pays off all of the people he hired that day, those who he has liberated from hunger and want of being unemployed, starting from those last hired and progressing to the first. And to each one he gives a full day's wage. To each he gives money to buy them and their families their daily bread. And those hired first complain and they grumble about it, claiming that they deserve more than the ones who were hired last because they have worked longer and harder. To which the landowner replies, I am not being unfair to you. I am giving you what you agreed to. Take your pay and go. I want to give the man who was hired last the same as I gave you. Don't I have the right to do what I want with my own money, or are you envious because I am jealous? Because I am generous? Are we like those who are hired first? Are we now experiencing something in shifts in our country right now as well, who are worried that we were hired first? Have we forgotten anxiety? Have we forgotten how it feels of starting a day wondering if we'll find enough work to feed ourselves or our families? The joy of being hired early enough in the day to ensure that we will indeed earn our daily bread, that our families will not starve. There will be enough to go around. Do we compare our own labor to the labor of others and conclude that we should have more than they have? After all, we've been working here longer. We should have more love. We should have more respect. We should have more thanks. We should have more privilege. We should have more say in how things are run. Undoubtedly, for those who think in worldly terms, the answer would be yes. But the parable tells us that this is not about what we deserve, but rather it is about what we all need, and with trust that we have been enabled to get where we need to go, it will be provided even if we do not feel we deserve it or judge others to be undeserving. A Canadian Anglican pastor, Richard Fairchild, says that it comes down to believing that we have enough. There is enough for everyone. And that all of us should have bread enough. He says, bread enough for each day in a world where normally only those fortunate enough to be hired first are able to get enough to eat. Bread enough for each day in a world where normally even those fortunate enough to have the strength to work are left standing at an unemployment line. Bread enough for each day in a world where even those who work hard and long in the heat of day are forced to agree to less than a day's wages because of a global market that looks only to maximize profit. Bread enough for each day, even with the very real concerns about health care and the overlooked concern there that should be our greatest, and that greatest concern should be for our own common greatest good, the good of all. Bread enough for each day for everyone who is willing to respond to the landowner's call to come and work, even though the landowner promises only what is fair for the labor they perform. Today's parable and liberation story is about bread enough. We should all have bread enough in the realm of God that Jesus says is in the here and the now, not in some distant future, and that the bread enough comes from God's grace. It is there for those who are hired first and promised a day's wage for a day's work, to those who are hired last and promised only what is fair. And we who feel this connection somehow to something greater, who have felt called, we who have felt called out of the unemployment line, we who have been called out of a bondage to those things that would destroy us, away from the situation that keeps us living our lives under this feeling of lead weights around us. Each one of us today here has been taught to pray and are urged to pray as Jesus taught us, give us this day our own daily bread. And we are given it. We are given that daily bread each and every day. If not in something that we can place on the table, it is given in the reminder to move forward with trust in the future at a time when everything around us makes us feel that we are lost in the wilderness, following those more lost than we. We are given manna from heaven. What is it? Day by day, the bread. Though we might stop and say, what is it? And more as we follow where we believe our path should be blazed to enter in and work in that vineyard for whatever may or may not seem fair to us in order to bring about that blessed community that we hope one day to build. It is beyond the wilderness that we are in right now. And like Moses, we may not all make it there, but your children might. Perhaps your children's children might. Perhaps we'll create a place where there's enough for all, for your children's children's children, and that's the hope of a promised land. Amen.